Hi everyone. Today we'll be talking about the first English colony in North America, the settlement of Virginia. The earliest English colonial promoters were dreamers and gamblers driven by their visionary imagination. The prime movers were politically well-connected gentlemen from the southwestern counties of England, where ambitious people looked westward toward Ireland and beyond for opportunities. Known as the West Country Men, the promoters included, among others, Sir Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, renowned for their exploits in sponsoring and successfully executing piracy upon Spanish silver shipments from the New World. Here we have a portrait painting of Sir Walter Raleigh. Zealous English patriots and devout Protestants, the West Country men yearned to advance their fortunes and consolidate their political influence at the royal court. Many of the West Country promoters had previous experience that gave them confidence that they, like the Spanish, could succeed in achieving New World conquests. Not a few of them had fought in the previous decades to subjugate the Irish. Treating the people of Ireland as treacherous beasts, the English waged a war of terror and intimidation, captured aptly in this sketch from the period. They executed prisoners by the hundreds, including women and children. Convinced of their own superior Protestant civilization, the English regarded Irish resistance as rank ingratitude by what they called stubborn barbarians. Dispossessing many Irish, the English invaders obtained great estates that they colonized with Protestant settlers from England and Scotland. Contrary to the Black legend, the English treated the Irish no better than the Portuguese and Spanish treated the Guanche. In fact, the conquest and colonization of Ireland served as the English school for overseas empire, the English equivalent, in other words, of the invasion of the Canaries. In wooing investors and the crown, the West Country promoters also addressed a pervasive anxiety over the proliferation of poverty, vagrancy, and crime in 16th century England. They pitched a radical program of overseas colonization by appealing to a conservative fear that the hierarchical society of England was eroding. In their view, England needed to expand outward, lest it collapse from within. Most English folk, perhaps 80%, lived in country villages and tended livestock or cultivated grains. Here we have an artist's interpretation of the 16th century English countryside. It was during the late 16th and early 17th centuries that rural people suffered increasing displacement and unemployment as their aristocratic landlords adopted a program known as enclosure. Meant to increase profits by rationalizing estates, enclosure fenced in large tracts of land and fenced out most of their former inhabitants. On enclosed estates, flocks of sheep, teams of hired laborers, and a few tenants replaced a larger number of peasant smallholders. The landlords also enclosed common lands, formerly used by the peasants to pasture livestock and to gather fuel, herbs, roots, fish, and rabbits. In the long term, the enclosure movement increased agricultural productivity and national wealth. In the short term, enclosure rendered homeless and miserable thousands of peasants and laborers. Probably about half the rural peasantry lost their lands between 1530 and 1630. The evicted and unemployed joined the swelling ranks of vagrants who roamed the land in search of work and charity. As a last resort, they stole, which brought growing numbers to the gallows, because theft was a capital crime. The new poor gravitated from the rural villages to the market towns and seaport cities, especially London, which grew from 120,000 people in 1550 to 200,000 in 1600, and then 375,000 by 1650. A sprawling and frightening metropolis, a hint of which is captured in this sketch. London became notorious for filth, poverty, plagues, fires, crime, and public executions. A city of extremes, London also hosted an expanding commerce manifest on the riverside docks, as well as displays of aristocratic splendor and power at the royal court. The increased poverty, vagrancy, and crime profoundly alarmed the propertied, who dreaded an imminent collapse into violent anarchy. Addressing propertied Englishmen, the West Country promoters announced that they had an easy solution for England's social woes. Exported to a new colony in Virginia, the idle and larcenous poor could be put to work, raising commodities for transport to and sale in England. By producing commodities that could not be raised at home, colonial plantations could improve England's balance of trade with other nations. For want of their own colonies, the English depended upon the Spanish and Portuguese empires for gold, silver, and high-value tropical produce, including sugar. Virginia plantations promised to improve the nation's terms of trade by providing import substitutes. Colonies would also provide a new market for English manufactured goods. In sum, the West Country promoters offered a neat package that would simultaneously control and employ the poor while generating new wealth and power for the realm. But the West Country men also had to allay fears that Indian resistance would frustrate the colonial ventures, ruining their investors. Dwelling upon the black legend that the Spanish were uniquely brutal colonizers, the promoters insisted that the Indians of Virginia would welcome the English as their liberators. The West Country men promised to woo Indian submission by applying what they called the fair and loving means suited to our English natures. Of course, the 16th century conquest and colonization of Ireland contradicted these English pretensions. In 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh sent about 100 colonists, all of them men, across the Atlantic to settle on Roanoke, a small island on what is today the North Carolina coast. The island's paltry potential for agriculture did not initially bother the colonists, who expected to be fed by the local Algonquin Indians. Commanded by Sir Ralph Lane, who we have here in this portrait painting, a hardened veteran of the grim war in Ireland, the colonists behaved no better than conquistadors. Initially hospitable, the Indians ran out of patience as the English persisted through the winter, demanding ever more maize while the native supply ran perilously low. In the early spring of 1586, the local chieftain, Wingina, refused to provide any more food. In a surprise attack, Lane killed Wingina and his deputy chiefs. Meant to secure maize by terrifying the survivors, Lane's atrocities instead put the Indians to flight, ending prospects for a new crop to feed the infant colony. The starving colonists eagerly abandoned Roanoke later that spring when English ships stopped by on the route home from raiding in the Spanish Caribbean. Trying again, in 1587, Sir Walter Raleigh and his associates dispatched a second set of colonists with a new civilian leader named John White. Here we have a little map of the Roanoke region. Shortly after arriving, White returned home to try and recruit reinforcements and more supplies. Unfortunately for him, and the colonists he left behind, the events of the Spanish Armada and its aftermath delayed his return. Not until August of 1590 was he able to make it back to Roanoke with a relief expedition, only to find the settlement mysteriously abandoned with no signs of attack by either Indians or the Spanish. The missing settlers became known as the Lost Colony of Roanoke. The lone clue was carved into a tree, the word Croatoan, the name of a nearby island. But the fearful and impatient English mariners refused to venture through the dangerously shallow waters to Croatoan to investigate. Sailing away in pursuit of Spanish treasure ships, the mariners abandoned any surviving colonists to their still mysterious fate. In 1607, the English tried yet again, this time at Chesapeake Bay, which offered better harbors, navigable rivers, and a much more fertile land. This is a map of the area created by one of the early leaders of the new settlement, Captain John Smith. And here the same map is in color, giving a better impression of the surrounding ocean and tributaries. About 200 miles long and 20 wide, the bay was a complex system of waterways, an environmental meeting place of tidewater estuaries and freshwater rivers that abounded in fish, shellfish, edible plants, and game animals. The broad coastal plain sustained about 24,000 Indians, divided into 30 tribes, but united by an Algonquin language and the rule of a paramount chief named Powhatan, who we see depicted in the top left of John Smith's map here. Powhatan led the largest and most powerful chiefdom that the English found along the Atlantic seaboard during the 17th century. In the late 1500s, he inherited power over 6 tribes, which he increased over time to 30 through a shrewd combination of diplomacy, intimidation, and war. From his especially large lodge on the York River, Powhatan displayed a large entourage of servants, 40 bodyguards, and 100 wives, all supported from the tribute in maize and deerskins collected from the subordinated villages. A council of veteran warriors and shamans advised the paramount chief. Unlike a nation-state, which relies upon bureaucratic institutions and a national identity to maintain obedience and collect taxes, a paramount chiefdom was an elaborate kinship network that gathered and redistributed tribute. Sometimes Powhatan retained and adopted the village chiefs he defeated and subordinated, taking their daughters as wives. Other chiefs he replaced with blood relatives, sons, brothers, and occasionally his sisters. If they paid their tribute and cooperated with his war parties, Powhatan usually left the subordinate chiefs alone to govern their own villages. He employed the tribute he received to stage feasts, to sustain the shamans, to support his wives, to reward his warriors, and to trade with outsiders. What came to be known as the English settlement of Jamestown was established beside a marsh on the north bank of the James River. For protection, as we can see in this illustration, the settlers surrounded their wooden shelters with a triangular stockade, mounted with cannon at the corners. Despite the defenses, the early settlers at Jamestown died in droves from disease and hunger. Of the initial 104, only 38 were alive 9 months later. Despite shipping hundreds of reinforcements annually, the Virginia Company barely kept ahead of the continuing deaths at Jamestown. In December 1609, there were 220 colonists. After an especially deadly winter, only 60 remained alive by the next spring. One starving colonist killed and ate his wife, for which he was tried, convicted, and burned at the stake. Between 1607, when the colony was launched, and 1622, the Virginia Company transported some 10,000 people to the settlement, but only 20% remained alive in 1622. Jamestown lay beside a broad swamp, which was good for defense against Spanish or Indian attack, but bad for the health of the colonists. In the hot and humid summer, the swamp bred millions of mosquitoes, carriers of malaria. In addition, the shallow wells at Jamestown were contaminated by brackish water, exposing the inhabitants to salt poisoning, especially during the summer when the river ran low. The stagnant river waters of summer and early fall also retained the garbage and excrement generated by the colonists, promoting the pathogenic microbes of dysentery and typhoid fever. The salt poisoning and the debilitating diseases killed many, and often rendered the rest too weak and apathetic to work. Unable to cultivate enough corn in summer, they starved during the winter and spring. Even when healthy, many colonists refused to work diligently at raising corn to feed themselves. They were an unstable and fractious mix of gentlemen adventurers in command and poor vagrants rounded up from the streets of London and forcibly sent to Virginia, virtually all men. Neither group had much prior experience with work. In England, birth and wealth had screened the gentlemen from manual labor, while the vagrants, for want of employment, had learned to survive by begging and stealing. Rather than cultivate corn, the first colonists at Jamestown preferred to search for precious metals in emulation of the Spanish conquistadors. Arriving with alluring misconceptions of a rich and easy land, the colonists experienced the hard realities as a demoralizing shock from which many never recovered. Initially, the Powhatan Indians regarded the English colonists with considerable ambivalence. Here we have a painting depicting a gathering of colonists and Indians in early Virginia. On the one hand, natives were intrigued by the technology of the visitors, especially their metal tools and weapons, which were far sharper, stronger, and more durable than stone implements. On the other hand, apart from the metal goods and firearms, the Indians saw little in European culture that appealed to them. The challenge confronting Powhatan and his people in 1607 was to turn the English newcomers to his advantage. Instead of trying to crush them and risk heavy casualties, Powhatan hoped to contain them, subject them to his power, enlist them as subordinate allies against his own enemies, and secure through trade their metals, including weapons. Unable to predict the future, the Algonquins did not know that the initial few colonists were the opening wedge for thousands to follow, bent upon transforming the land and destroying the Indian world. For their part, the ethnocentric English were poorly prepared to understand and accept a culture so different from their own. Coming from a more property-ridden and labor-driven culture, the English considered the Indians lazy. Because the English expected men to cultivate crops and women to tend permanent homes, they regarded the native women as drudges and the men as lazy exploiters. Because the English encased themselves in heavy clothing, they defined as savage any people as scantily clad as the Indians. And because they worshipped a single, omnipotent God, they disdained the native pantheism as paganism at best and devil worship at worst. In the beginning, the colonists at Jamestown sought not to exterminate the Indians, but to assimilate them as menials. Unlike the Spanish in New Mexico and the French in Canada, the English sent no missionaries to convert the Indians of Virginia. More thoroughly commercial, the English meant to Christianize the Indians by first absorbing them as economic subordinates. Indian laborers could then be indoctrinated in Protestant Christianity by the regular church services of the colonists. English colonizers had a peculiar confidence that their economic self-interest served God. Of course, by subordinating the Indians, the Virginia promoters meant to free up most of their lands for the settlement of English plantations and farms. Savages had no right to keep any land they did not exploit to its fullest potential. The colonizers refused to see that the Indians did occupy, use, and shape their land. Overlooking the many native villages and extensive fields of maize, the English insisted that God required them to improve the wilderness into productive farmland, subduing the Indians in the process. The English insisted that their changes would benefit the Indians, who had therefore no right to resist. Indians who did push back against the bridle of English rule could expect to be treated like wild and dangerous beasts. In Virginia, as in Ireland, the colonial leaders sustained an overwhelming sense of cultural superiority that was impervious to the mounting evidence of their own errors in a land long mastered by the Indians. The colonists did not understand that the local Indians had scant surplus corn to spare, raising little more than what they needed every year. If pressed too hard for food, the Indians lashed out. When 17 colonists imposed themselves on one village, the natives killed them, stuffed their mouths with maize as a sign of contempt, and left the corpses for their countrymen to discover. Noting the Spanish success at conquering Indians by capturing their paramount chiefs, the English, especially Captain John Smith, who we have here in this portrait painting, hoped to trick and seize Powhatan. Unfortunately for Captain Smith, Powhatan was too clever and shrewd. He declined all invitations to visit Jamestown. Instead of capturing Powhatan, Smith became his captive after stumbling into an ambush in the woods. Here's Captain Smith's own illustration of his ordeal. Powhatan seized the opportunity to ritually adopt Smith as a subordinate chief, not unlike a morning war ritual where the captive is saved at the last moment, ritually adopted, and given a new identity. Staged as a mock execution interrupted by Pocahontas, the daughter of Powhatan, the ritual was supposed to render Smith and the English into tributaries, effectively like a 31st tribe within Powhatan's confederacy. Here we have an artist's imagining of Pocahontas. Her interruption of Smith's execution has been captured in European art and American art many times over. Here are a couple of examples. Powhatan misunderstood Smith's gratitude at survival for consent to his terms, and Smith misunderstood the ritual as no more than an execution stopped by Powhatan's chivalrous daughter. Upon his release and return to Jamestown, Smith resumed his tactics of bullying Indians to obtain corn. Pursuing a policy of containment rather than total war, Powhatan relied upon the tribe closest to Jamestown, known as the Paspahegh, to observe and harass the colonists. The strategy was more deadly than Powhatan realized, for it kept the colonists contained in disease-ridden Jamestown and away from healthier and more fertile places. When the English complained to Powhatan about the Paspahegh harassment, he said he wanted to continue trade with the colony, but could do little about a few malcontents beyond his control. Frustrated, the English made violent and terrifying examples of resisting Indians. In August 1610, the man we see in this portrait painting, Captain George Percy, surprised and attacked a Paspahegh village, killing at least 65 inhabitants and destroying with fire their homes and fields of corn. After taking prisoner the wife and children of the local chieftain, the colonists headed back to Jamestown by boat. Along the way, for sport, they threw the children overboard and shot them in front of their mother as they tried to swim for shore. Back at Jamestown, the governor rebuked Percy, not for his brutality, but for his leniency in sparing the woman's life. He had her run through with a sword and executed. The simmering conflict between the colonists and the Powhatan Indians remained at a stalemate until 1613, when the English captured Pocahontas. Held in Jamestown and indoctrinated by the English, she reportedly accepted Christian conversion, an event imagined in this painting, called the Baptism of Pocahontas. Taking a new Christian name, Rebecca, Pocahontas also married one of the colonists, John Rolfe, in 1614. At this point, weary with war, Powhatan reluctantly made peace with the English. Seizing the promotional opportunity, the Virginia Company brought Rolfe and Pocahontas to London to try and drum up greater investment and Crown support for the colony. Dressed in fine English clothing, the lovely Pocahontas suggested the ease of assimilating the natives. Here we have a couple of artistic renderings of Pocahontas as Rebecca. One black and white, and this one in color. And here we have a painting of Pocahontas with her English husband, John Rolfe. The appearance of easy assimilation of the Virginia natives, however, was deceiving. Pocahontas fell ill in London and died in March 1617. She was around 21 years old. Her father, Powhatan, expired the following year. Power at this point passed to Powhatan's brother, Opechancanough, who from long and bitter experience despised the English. Here we have a sketch of Opechancanough. For a time, he cleverly kept his anger and resentment hidden from the English. He insinuated that he intended to convert to Christianity, and he invited the colonists to spread out and settle on any lands not occupied by Indian villages, putting to sleep English suspicions and encouraging their vulnerable dispersion. Then on March 22nd, 1622, in a well-coordinated surprise attack, the Indians destroyed the outlying farms, killing 347 men, women, and children, at the time nearly a third of the colonists in Virginia. The survivors rallied at Jamestown and a few other fortified settlements, while the Indians killed livestock and burned farms. After the initial shock and horror, the colonial leaders felt delighted by the opportunity to dispossess and exterminate the Indians. The Virginians developed the strategy practiced in subsequent colonial wars, of waiting until just before corn harvest to attack and destroy the Indian villages and their crops, consigning the natives to a winter and spring of exposure and starvation. In May 1623, when the Indians' hunger was greatest, the English pretended that they were ready to make peace. At the conclusion of the negotiations, the English invited the 250 attending Indians to drink a toast of alcohol. The Indian share was poisoned. Drugged and incapacitated, the victims were easily finished off by the swords of the vengeful English. But Opechancanough had not attended this meeting, and he persisted in resistance until the English offered a real peace in 1632. They extorted massive land concessions, which permitted their settlements to spread northward up Chesapeake Bay and the Rappahannock and Potomac rivers. On April 18, 1644, Opechancanough staged a second and even deadlier surprise attack, killing more than 400 colonists. But this was a smaller proportion of a much larger colonial population, 10,000, which had come to outnumber the local Indians in the more than 20 years since Opechancanoug's first uprising. English counterattacks destroyed most of the Indian towns along the rivers, dispersing the survivors into the hinterland. In 1646, the English captured Opechancanough, who was about 100 years old, nearly blind, and so crippled that he had to be carried on a litter. The governor put his trophy prisoner on display in Jamestown, but an angry soldier one day shot Opechancanough dead. The murder officially put an end to the paramount chieftain built up by Powhatan since the start of the 17th century. Disease and war reduced the Indians of Powhatan's once great confederacy from 24,000 in 1607 to only 2,000 by 1669. Losing almost all their lands, the survivors were confined on small reservations surrounded by colonial settlements. Restricting the surviving Indians as a security risk, Virginia law invited landholders to shoot any native caught trespassing on their farms. While the Indians' presence and power diminished on the coastal plain, the colonist numbers and prosperity surged, especially during the 1650s and 1660s, as they occupied the fertile lands recently wrested from the Indians. Responding to colonial opportunity, emigration from England to the Chesapeake more than doubled, from about 8,000 per decade during the 1630s and 1640s to 18,000 per decade during the 1650s and 1660s. The Chesapeake colonial population grew from 13,000 in 1650 to 41,000 in 1670. To try and generate more settlement, the Virginia Company adopted in Virginia what it called a headright system, which awarded land freely to men with the means to pay for their own passage and that of others across the Atlantic. Such emigrants received 50 acres apiece and another 50 acres for every servant or relative brought over at their own expense. Servants were also entitled to 50 acres each, if and when they survived the terms of their indenture. This added incentive for people to come to Virginia, even if they could not afford the cost of travel. Land ownership was an impossibility for most back in England. Despite the risks, it was a possibility in the Chesapeake. As private property owners, rather than employees of the Virginia Company, the colonists showed much greater initiative and effort in cultivating the corn, squash, and beans that ensured their subsistence. But to prosper, they still needed a commercial crop to market in England. In 1616, as we can see in our next couple of images, The planters in the Chesapeake began growing tobacco. John Rolfe, husband of the ill-fated Pocahontas, had first introduced it and showed the colonists how to raise the crop before his return to England. A New World plant, long cultivated in the West Indies, tobacco had become popular for smoking, as we can see from this illustration, in much of England and Europe. Because tobacco plants prefer a long, hot, and humid growing season, the crop thrived in Virginia, but not in England, giving the Chesapeake farmers a comparative advantage. Blessed with numerous harbors and an extensive river system, Virginia also welcomed the shipping needed to carry tobacco in bulk across the Atlantic to European consumers. Chesapeake tobacco production surged from 200,000 pounds in 1624 to 3 million pounds in 1638, as Virginia outstripped the West Indies to become the principal supplier of tobacco to Europe. During the 1620s, tobacco sold in England for about 5 to 10 times as much as it cost to produce in the Chesapeake. That meant that if a planter could obtain land and a few laborers and manage to keep them alive and working, he could make more in a year than in a decade spent in England. Because of the opportunities for wealth that tobacco provided, both to planters and, at least for a while, indentured servants, immigration to Virginia continued to increase from year to year. It was specifically increased immigration, not natural increase, that drove population growth in the colony, for the number of women remained small in proportion to that of white men, and the annual mortality rate from disease remained at about 25% all the way up until the 1650s. As tobacco cultivation expanded and the population grew, the planters needed more land, which they obtained at the Indians' expense. The Chesapeake tobacco boom came too late to save the faltering Virginia Company, which never recovered from the enormous debts it took on over the early years of establishing the colony. In 1624, the impatient Crown terminated the company's charter, taking over control of Virginia as the first royal colony in the New English Empire of the Americas. The Crown acted to secure the growing revenue generated by the tobacco trade. Paying an especially heavy tax, tobacco was responsible for 25% of the customs revenue collected by the Crown in England during the 1660s. In 1632, the Crown decided to set aside about 12 million acres of land at the northern head of Chesapeake Bay as a second colony, named Maryland, after the queen of the new monarch, Charles I, who we have here in this portrait painting. The king gave the new colony to a favorite aristocrat and political ally, Cecilius Calvert, the second Lord Baltimore, to own and govern as a proprietary colony. Here we have a painting of Calvert. During the 17th century, the English developed two types of colonial governments: royal and proprietary. Relatively few until the 18th century, the royal colonies belonged to the Crown. Initially more numerous, the proprietary colonies belonged to private interests. By owning and governing a colony, Lord Baltimore sought to gain additional wealth and to provide refuge for his fellow Catholics. Harassed in England by the Protestant majority, some Catholics contemplated emigration to an American colony. As a Catholic sympathizer, King Charles I favored Lord Baltimore's plan to demonstrate that a policy of religious toleration could permit Protestants and Catholics to live together in harmony. Tending to his estates and political interest, Lord Baltimore remained in England and entrusted the governorship of Maryland to his younger brother, Leonard Calvert. In 1634, the new governor led 2 ships laden with colonists, both Protestant and Catholic, across the Atlantic to Chesapeake Bay. Contrary to Lord Baltimore's hopes, relatively few Catholics after this first migration moved to Maryland. Instead, most of his colonists were Protestants, primarily relocating Virginians. Eager to attract settlers of any Christian faith, the proprietor adopted an especially generous headright system that granted 100 acres for every adult, free or indentured, transported to the new colony, plus 50 acres for every child less than 16 years old. As a frontier settlement, Maryland offered greater opportunities to ambitious men of modest means than did older, more crowded, and increasingly competitive Virginia. By attracting experienced colonists, Maryland benefited from the expertise garnered by hard trials and many errors in the older colony of Virginia. Suffering fewer and shorter growing pains, Maryland, as we can see in our final illustration here, rapidly prospered as a tobacco colony. So after an immense cost in lives, both native peoples and colonists, the English had secured a lucrative, dynamic, and expansive base on the North American continent. Their once tenuous beachhead had become 2 thriving provinces. Their success guaranteed that there would be more expansion in the way of more English settlements to come. As the original West Country promoters had hoped, Virginia and Maryland consumed English manufactures and produced an agricultural staple that replaced an import, improving the nation's balance of trade. Further, just as they predicted, the Chesapeake colonies absorbed thousands of poor laborers considered bothersome and dangerous in England. Of course, from the perspective of native peoples, the English spread with destructive rapidity, imperiling the Indian world. Okay, so that does it for early Virginia for now. Next time we'll start talking about New England and the people we call the Puritans.